Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Lynn Mooney, co-owner of Women and Children First Bookstore, and I'm here this evening with Lucy Diavolo and Anne Elizabeth Moore to celebrate the publication of Anne Elizabeth Moore's most recent book, Gentrifier, a Memoir. I'm going to make a couple quick announcements before I turn things over to them. But thank you so much for being here this evening. I think we're in for a terrific conversation. First of all, we introduce our virtual events the same way that we used to introduce our in-person events, and that is with a land acknowledgement. So please join me in acknowledging that the land on which our bookstore stands is the occupied, unceded territory of the Peoria and Potawatomi people. We encourage you to learn more about land acknowledgements and about the rightful owners of the land where you are viewing this evening's event and their importance, because the pain and the struggle and the trauma continues both back in time and forward, and we need to be part of addressing those traumas. A little bit of housekeeping for this evening's event. You'll see at the bottom of the screen an ask a question. I guess it's just a phrase on your screen, but notice that your screen contains the phrase ask a question. If you do have a question for Lucy or Anne Elizabeth this evening, please post it there. We love lots of chat, but sometimes questions can get lost there amongst all the other things we're chatting about. So if you have a question for either of them, please put it in the ask a question field. And thanks again for being here. Let's go on to our purpose. First, I'm going to introduce Lucy and Anne Elizabeth, but I also want to play a placeholder out there that in the course of the evening, we're going to learn about an organization called Rent Party Detroit. It's a group that raises funds to support families that are under immediate threat of eviction, and they work in Detroit, Hamtramck, and Highland Park, Michigan. And their founder is going to become part of the conversation later in the evening. And we do encourage you to support and donate to that organization and their important work, because funding sources for that work are slim, thin on the ground for sure. So I just wanted to put a placeholder on that. I want all of us to come away with a commitment to that organization and their work. All right. Lucy Diavolo is a writer, editor, and musician who co-founded the Trans Feminine Alliance of Chicago. She also served as politics editor on staff at Teen Vogue and was the editor of No Planet B, a Teen Vogue guide to the climate crisis, published in 2021 by Haymarket Books. Her work, both fiction and nonfiction, has been published in a variety of outlets, and she now lives in rural Ohio. Anne Elizabeth Moore has written several critically acclaimed nonfiction books, including the Lambda Literary Award-nominated body horror, Capitalism, Fear, Misogyny, Jokes, which is the Chicago Public Library Best Book of 2017, and Sweet Little Cunt, which won an Eisner Award. She lives in Hobart, New York, with her cat, Captain America, which makes me sad because in the course of reading this book, I got to know some of her other cats too. Gentrifier was described by my business partner, Sarah, today as a sharp, funny, informative, and infuriating book. I see it as being in conversation with two recent books by other smart women writers who I admire very much. Rebecca Solnit's Recollections of My Non-Existence, which is a memoir about her experience as a young woman being an unwitting gentrifier in San Francisco. And also Yul Abyss's recent book, Having and Being Had, which is, among other things, about housing and neighborhoods, money, and class. So at this point, I'm going to turn things over to Lucy and Anne Elizabeth, and thank you so much for letting me be part of this.
Thanks so much, Lynn.
Thank you. Great. Well, Anne, do you want to get us started with your reading for this evening?
Yeah, Lucy, did we talk about something from chapter 4? Is that what I'm recalling?
I think we discussed 4 and or 5.
Okay.
Yeah,
I had a great section from 4 I wanted to read a
great.
couple of excerpts from, if that works for you.
Please, yeah, just let me know when you're done and I'll hop back on.
Cool. Sadia is home on a weekday morning, and I ask her why she's not in school. The water, she says, and shrugs. During a subsequent internet search, I discover there is a boil advisory in the city, and that we are not supposed to drink water from the tap until further notice, although residents have received no notification. Sadia returns to school 4 days later. She is never warned against drinking the water from the water fountains, although water bottles are suddenly issued each student. It is the end of the workday, and I am stuck at the exit of a parking structure after my physical therapy session has ended. The machine will not take my credit card, so the gate will not open, and 8 cars are lined up behind me, honking and becoming angry that I am blocking the entrance. But I cannot move my car without busting through the unopened gate. The only option I have is to press a small button that says "Help" and wait to see what happens. 7 minutes later, more cars have joined the line behind me. A woman about 3 cars back opens her window and screams, "Can't somebody just swipe her through? It's not like we actually expect these machines to work. We do this every day." Whereupon someone in the car in front of her gets out, scuttles up to the machine, and swipes their employee ID. The gate opens. I leave. The mayor announces that the city will resume street cleaning. A few months later, signs do indeed appear around the neighborhood. No parking, street cleaning, Thursday, 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. So Wednesday night, I park on a different block. Walking to my house, I see that my neighbors have chosen a different interpretation of the sign. They are parked on lawns, front yards, empty lots, the sidewalk. A cacophony of tan and beige minivans, Suzukis, Nissans, Hondas, parked where people usually go. The street cleaners never arrive. Eventually, the neighborhood returns to normal. One day I see a young girl, maybe 4 years old, holding a closed umbrella. She is frowning, holding one end of the umbrella in her right hand, repeatedly beating it into her left palm, except that the umbrella is so large in her tiny hands that she can barely grasp it. She looks angry, but stands a ways off from anyone, alone, staring at a corner of the sidewalk. She's beating the umbrella into her palm like a cop threatening a perp, and frowning very, very hard, glowering, but at nothing that I can see. I realize that she has watched a man in her life do this many, many times. I wanted to share a couple of these sections because the book has a, Lucy, if you're ready for us, you can come back. The book has kind of a unique structure, which is largely based on, it's a bunch of vignettes that kind of act like jokes, but many of them are not very funny.
Yeah, I was really struck reading through it. It almost was like scrolling back through someone's Twitter timeline. Just getting these little snippets and moments, and some of them are chock full of political meaning and personal meaning, and some of them are very funny, and some of them are very sad, and some of them are just very observational. It's such a fascinating structure to do nonfiction in, I thought, because it really created a sort of mosaic effect almost.
Yeah, I think Jace Clayton called it kaleidoscopic, and the more that I've been thinking about that, the more it is like you can devise different kinds of stories depending on what you're most drawn to in the moment.
Absolutely, and it makes total sense because as you're spinning the contraption, similar themes come back and the colors come back, maybe in a different shape.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was really fun to play with. It's like the funnest thing I've ever written in a way that also, it was also one of the most heartbreaking things I've ever written. So it was necessary for it to become fun in order to actually complete it. But then also, devising a complicated enough structure that I could stay with it, like emotionally the whole time without freaking out and wanting to do something else was really quite a trick.
Yeah, I was wondering about that too, because, the old equation, tragedy plus time equals comedy. What was the timeline like for writing this? How close were you to everything? How much space did you need to give yourself to get a lot of this on the page?
Yeah, way too close. Some of it was like that stuff I mean, some of it hadn't happened by the time I wrote the first draft of the book. And some of it had only happened days before I turned in the final draft of the book, like the actual final version, final draft. You can't touch this anymore, or we will actually murder you version. So there's a lot of really raw stuff in there.
Yeah.
But also, you know, I'm one of those writers that sometimes like give me a horrible deadline and I will absolutely deliver. And so there's some of that too. But then there's also this like, fuck it, I don't know, this is basically a joke book. I'll just put some words down and it'll be funny. And so there's a good mix of things that make sense and things that maybe should have been thought through a little more thoroughly.
But there is some stuff that, you know, the research that went into a lot of this is really evident as well. And especially, you know, knowing your journalistic background, it's very evident, you know, when you put on your reporter's cap to get into some of the macro level stuff that you're dealing with on a very personal level as well. You know, I think some of those passages you just read is so much about the failures of government and infrastructure on an everyday basis. And then you are able to pull us out from that and look at a lot of these sort of, you know, the scale of these things that it's difficult to understand except from a statistical level.
Yeah, it was a really interesting thing. I did feel, you know, in the way that as a reader, you're going through and you're like, oh my God, she's moving me from time to time and I can't figure out what decade it is, much less like where I am in the world. But as I was constructing the book, I had a lot of that as well. Like, am I deep in the moment and I'm describing something I saw, or am I really super away from this actual scene I'm describing and thinking about it as a way that it reflects this sort of, you know, international political economy, this moment in time, this like weirdly regressive political situation that we find ourselves in. I mean, I felt really like jumbled around in a way that I think was slightly more influential on the way the text works than social media. I mean, I'm a big Twitter person. I love it. And I think it's like good as like a both a writing prompt because it's there. You've got to fill it in. So you got to come up with the right number of words to stick in the thing. And but also yeah, I just like the way that it functions. Still, I think that social media was slightly less influential on this book as a whole than the notion of trauma and how we experience and survive trauma was slightly more pressing on this, because it does always feel, to me, trauma always feels as if it is happening in the exact moment. And so the idea that this book would comprise, you know, several decades of my life, but concentrate on 5-ish years, 6-ish years, but still all be told in the exact present tense, was a way of trying to get at that a little bit.
Yeah. No, I think it all feels very present, and you know that helps really, I don't know, really personalize a lot of it, as well as just keep the reader kind of on our toes, I think, in a way.
Yeah, I'm big about keeping the reader on their toes. I
Yeah.
apologize to everyone who's ever read my work.
No, it's fine. You know, sometimes it's nice to be cradled like a little baby, and sometimes it's nice to hold on and try to.
And,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I really wanted to talk to you about Virginia Woolf.
Yes.
Because every chapter of the book, I believe, starts with a quote from A Room of One's Own. And a couple of times in there, you get into, you know, sort of, you'll pardon the turn of phrase, modernizing the proposals in that text, as well as, you know, thinking a little more critically about Virginia Woolf than maybe we're encouraged to in a lot of creative writing classes. At least in my experience in undergrad. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about, you know, how Virginia is at play in this text.
Yeah, I mean, I have so many feelings about Virginia Woolf. Like, it's ridiculous how many feelings I have about this person, that I've never met. I haven't even read all of her work. I've probably read 3 books and several essays. And but she also, as a thinker, has probably influenced my whole body of work far more than almost any other living writer or writer that is currently in print. So yeah, I have a lot of complicated feelings about her, and they're so deep and so complicated that all I could do was like set up this homage that was like, okay, lady, look, I'm going to talk about your stuff for a long time in every chapter of this thing, and I'm going to argue with it vociferously. And that's just the way that it's going to be. And within that, heated dialogue-ish, I mean, it's a monologue, but theoretically it's a dialogue. The idea is that you will come to understand Virginia Woolf slightly better, which is also important to my project, even though basically in the end, I want you to think really critically about what she's done. And with A Room of One's Own in particular, everyone remembers her as having advocated for writers to have a room of their own. But in fact, what she was arguing was that they need to have a room of their own and they need to be paid to sit in it and write, on top of which they need, a certain number of amenities that are sort of provided for them, and they need a system in which they can operate, and a community that supports them, and also sort of readers and publishers and people who are willing to let them do what they need to do in order to do what she calls sort of allow for the sort of free expansiveness of thought that writing is. I personally don't necessarily think that writing requires a free expansiveness of thought. It would be great if I ever felt I was provided for well enough to feel expansiveness of thought. But like, the truth is that most of my writing comes out of this, like, what the fuck? I can't, I feel cornered and I feel awful. And I'm so like frustrated with this. That's one of the things about which we don't get along.
Yeah. Well, and I think the entire book is a testament to expanding that understanding of, a room of one's own is not just 4 walls and a roof and a desk. Because a lot of, I think the struggles you talk about having in Detroit, sort of finding a sense of place or a literary community, speak to what you're saying, that sort of expanded notion of what it takes to sort of feel plugged in as a writer.
Yeah, for sure. And there's also, I really struggle with Virginia Woolf's queer relationships / identity. I mean, I love Orlando. I love this story behind it. I love those ideas, but Virginia Woolf herself doesn't feel like a loving person to me. So I really have all these difficulties with like how much I want to share an identity with her, or how much I feel like we really have in common. Yeah, whatever. I could get complicated about Virginia Woolf until the end of time, but
well, let's dig in a little deeper, because you and I talked last week briefly, and one of the things that really stuck with me from that conversation was, thinking of all of this dialogue with Woolf in terms of a dialogue with modernism, and how she is, in a lot of ways a representative of that strain of literature, and how a lot of the ways that her work can be criticized for falling short are the ways that modernism itself often falls short. And, what we talked about last week briefly, how Detroit itself is emblematic of, a lot of the failures of modernism, in the way that the city was a sort of modernist utopia in a sense, and then that all started to fall apart when the political economy abdicated any sort of responsibility it might have had to the people there.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's true that Virginia Woolf in many ways is sort of the modernist construct that is the exception because she was a woman. that proves the rule because she was a woman. And so she's sort of the linchpin that holds together all of these notions of modernism that I actually fundamentally object to, that every part of my being is not accepting of. And so the free expansiveness of thought notion, which is a very sort of masculine colonialist idea that, you know, someone just needs to spend a couple of minutes alone and survey the land and make decisions about how things work and then put them on paper, and then they will be respected for having decided how the world operates. And that's not the way that I think about things. And also we've seen many examples of the fallacy of that way of thinking in recent years. And, you know, Detroit as a function of modernism really was about establishing factories using some of the most, you know, innovative, thoughtful, modernist architectural constructs that were being thought at the time, and they were implemented, and they're gorgeous, like fascinating, beautiful. And along with these visual based and structural modernist movement elements, we had a sort of modernist way of thinking about the world, which was that, you know, you worked X number of days and then the thing, you know, got done, and then you would go home and you participated in your corporate life, and then you participated in your personal life, and then you participated in your sleeping life, and then the cycle continued. And it really didn't take very much to upend that, you know, and then all of a sudden people were losing jobs because of, you know, there was a sort of oil crisis, and then there was cheaper labor available elsewhere. And so factories were shutting down, and all of a sudden the whole way of life that had been built around the same design scheme that modernism had been, that these factories had been constructed on, fell apart, and people were just losing jobs like crazy by the mid 50s. And then by the 70s, I mean, it was really completely out of control. And then the city that sort of really did literally birth modernism, I mean, it was born in Grand Rapids, not too far. Grand Rapids? I think Grand Rapids. But in Michigan, not too far away from Detroit. Sort of watched it crumble, but then there's never really been any acknowledgement in the larger sense that modernism had failed or didn't work. You know, there was just more of this like, well, that's over. Like, now we have this other thing. And, you know, it's like, I don't know. In many ways, like, yeah, go ahead.
I think that, you know, what's fascinating is, especially to think of it in terms of sort of a tension with postmodernism, the end of modernism felt like the end of a world that could make sense. As you were saying, you know, talking about the sort of routine of life that was possible, and, you know, how easy it is to capitalize on the ability to sell people a narrative about their own life that they can settle into. And I think, you know, especially as we've seen these last 2 decades, but especially the last couple of years, as the world makes less and less sense, it's much harder to maintain those forces of capitalist exploitation. I think that's, you know, an underlying factor in the quote unquote labor shortage that's happening right now. Is as the world makes less and less sense, it's more difficult, I think, to convince people to just show up for work every day and then go have your social life and then go to bed.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was on the public radio affiliate station in Detroit today, which is WDET. And the section before mine was a Washington Post columnist who was based in Detroit and was sort of covering the Detroit area. And apparently her recent column, and I don't mean to bash this woman, if she happens to be in the audience, I completely apologize for bastardizing your work, but her column apparently was like, hey, stop yelling at restaurant workers. Everybody's just trying to get by. which is completely true and totally valid. And like, yes, we are living in a moment where people just need to be nicer to each other. On the other hand, one of the people that called in was like, I wrote this down. Let me see if I can actually find my notes here. This woman called in and she was like, oh, her name was literally Karen. She was like, hey, I'm a college professor and I work part-time at Menards. And so I have feelings about the retail industry. And the moderator was like, okay, let's go back to like you being a college professor and needing to work part-time at Menards. And she was like, well, yeah, so I took these 2 jobs after I was laid off from my government job with the city of Detroit. And they cut our health care. And I all of a sudden had to pay $600 a month with a $7,000 deductible. And I have this health issue. And it was like, it only took 3 seconds in conversation with some rando calling into the local NPR affiliate to get to this completely bananas situation that was like, your life has been fundamentally destroyed by the city of Detroit yanking something from you that you were promised during the decades that you worked for them. And that, you know, doesn't necessarily play into the failures of modernism, but like that kind of story is so common in Detroit. It's just heartbreaking. And I'm listening and I'm like trying to get ready to like psych myself up to be like, buy my book and everything's amazing. And ha ha ha, here's a bunch of jokes. And I just was like trying to hold back tears from this woman just calling into this show today.
Yeah. I mean, thank God it's radio, right? Nobody can see you cry.
Yeah, exactly. I pull that so often.
Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating because the book is so full of, you know, whether it's that the street cleaning story you just read or the water bottles at the school. You know, I think such a running theme is the failure of the politicians in Detroit. And I know you and I went back and forth a little bit about, you know, do we call this the failures of capitalism or the failures of neoliberalism? I wonder if you could sort of tell our audience a little bit about, you know, because one of the things I love about the book is that you never try to shove your own interpretation down anybody's throat. You really try to just layer the pieces there until it sort of feels inevitable that we come to the conclusion that we do. So I wonder if you could spoon feed us just a little bit about the sort of the political failures that help define your experience of Detroit.
Yeah. I mean, I've been writing about capitalism now for literally 40 years. I've started publishing when I was 11, and my first zine was really about like, why is television so crazy? You know, why am I being marketed to in this like really intense way? I'm just this girl and there's nobody on TV that looks like me, and there's nobody on TV that thinks like me. And like, so navigating the commercial realm and then the political economy that exists behind it has been something that I've been doing for literally 4 decades. And it's really interesting because I've never wanted to hit people over the head with political theory and be like, here is the way that you are to think about things from now on. What I am interested in doing is writing about how the political economy affects our bodies and our emotions. I think with body horror, you know, what I was most interested in doing was trying to figure out, like, to literally track how capitalism works within our bodies. And with Gentrifier, it was much more about how these things come to affect us emotionally and how, like, very, very deeply we don't even notice how thoroughly some of the things that we're sort of forced to ingest end up controlling, dictating the way that we experience the world. And for me, in Gentrifier was, you know, this horribly depressing, gut-wrenching, like vomitous making situation that really did come directly from, first of all, the project of winning a free house and having all these like weird structures attached to that weren't made clear at the beginning. But then later, when the history of the house becomes more clear to the reader, the realizing that the history of the house had been extremely damaging to one person in particular. And so what I want to do and what my work is about is getting you to feel how capitalism operates in the structure of the text, so that you can later bring that memory of that feeling to the way that we operate in the world. And maybe that, I've been thinking we're coming to the end of capitalism for my entire life, and we're definitely obviously not. But maybe this new strategy will help us get there.
Hey,
and if it doesn't,
works,
I'll try
right?
something else. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's fascinating because we were talking a little bit about your background and your stuff with Punk Planet, and I wonder if you have thoughts on sort of the co-optation of radical politics by a lot of these sort of mainstream market forces that are effectively agents of our political economy and its maintenance, but who have seemed to have gotten wise to the idea that they can make a quick buck, especially in the youth demo, by sort of learning the right words and using them as close to correctly as they can manage.
Yeah. All right. Which is an excellent way of putting it. I mean, I did write, a whole book that pretty much tracked that exact thing happening, that was called Unmarketable Brandalism, Copy Fighting Marketing, and the Erosion of Integrity. And it was published in 2007 and picked up by Pamela Anderson in a gleaming white bikini in 2008. And
we love Comrade Pam, don't we?
Still funny. Yeah. She's amazing. Totally true. But the thing that's interesting to me about young people, slash the kids today, slash the folks who constantly litter my lawn with their goings on about town, is that they really do genuinely have an ability to engage in critical thought that is well beyond anything I ever imagined. And so in Gentrifier, one of the reasons that book relied so heavily on my two neighbors, Nishat and Sadia, who, if they're in the audience, do some chatting right now. I don't see that they are, but I was chatting them up on Instagram all day, so maybe they're still busy on Instagram. It just was amazing sitting with preteens, teenagers, and like walking them through some of the, problems that sort of face Detroit, and the problems that were coming up around my house, and the problems that were coming up in their lives and their futures. And just seeing the way that they learned to navigate those things and to fight them. And these are, young women from a totally different culture, from a culture, Muslim Bengali, that is often derided in the US and, has really faced a lot of difficulties in Detroit in particular. And none of that stuck to them. They just were really like, let's do this. I'm gonna, write up a petition, and we're gonna make sure that in the future, the kids in my neighborhood, we don't need to take exams during Ramadan. And that failed the first year because the school administration decided to completely ignore it. And also, like, there's some water dripping on my head during my class, my homeroom every morning. So I'll just do the petition again next year, and it fails again the next year. So I'll just do it again the year after that. And I'm just going to like stick to my guns and do this thing. Yeah. So it was really, it's like, also, there's also this like really deeply hopeful and enlivening thing that keeps happening with young folks that always makes me think like, oh, maybe they can actually pull this stuff off that I imagined was possible in my day.
Absolutely. It's fascinating what you said about sort of helping people build the muscles for critical thinking. Because I feel like that sort of dovetails with what you were saying about how you try to craft to help people, not to beat them over the head with the hammer of theory, but to give them the muscles to pick it up themselves.
Yeah, I want in my writing, and also slightly less so in person, but I also want this in person, to make the other person feel smarter than they had previously realized they could be. And when I am writing, I'm always trying to like give them enough clues so that they can come to the answer before I actually spell it out. And so that by the time that I spell it out, we're both over it. Like I knew it was coming because I wrote the book, and you hopefully have been able to figure it out by now anyway. And so let's just like move on, and then we can kind of go to the next joke or whatever. But it's interesting because male readers, cis male readers, often write to me and they say things like, why don't you ever write about capitalism? Or did you know? And then they will explain to me the point of the entire book that I have just spent 7 years working on. And it's always like, yeah, you know why you think that? Because I told you to think it in the book that I wrote. And now you think it. And you're mad that I didn't tell you that in those words? Anyway, now I'm just complaining about my readers. That's really solid. That is solid marketing, Anne. Good work.
It's okay. I mean, because you write a lot about teaching as well. I wonder, it sounds like, how do you bring this sort of framework to the classroom? There's a lot of great scenes. I was really struck by, I don't remember what the quote was from, but it was about, the difference between GM and Chrysler is a farce. And your students proceeded to have a very lively debate about the history of those two makes and their, labor practices and all these things that distinguish them from each other.
Yeah. And those are totally real, which in the cultural realm and the theory realm and the world of writing and literature, we theorize that there's no difference between GM and Chrysler and Dodge and Ford. And we write as if that were true. And then you go and you live in the city where GM and Chrysler and Dodge and Ford exist, and where everyone you meet is somehow related to the manufacturer of one or the other of those vehicles, and or the design, and or the management of the money. And you're like, oh, actually, those are really different. And our cultural leaders have sort of failed to understand the very real on the ground labor practices that go into these different things. And that's just, that's one of those things that it just is more complicated than we would like it to be when we're sitting in our little ivory towers, our little writing holes.
Our ivory basements.
Yeah. Our ivory basements. Yeah. Our ivory bookshelf lined Zoom rooms.
Yeah.
It took like, a room full of like 19-year-olds that were like, I don't know, man, my dad designs Dodge and he's never, da 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 da. Before I was like, oh shit, yeah, Benjamin was actually wrong about that. Like, okay, now I can move on with my life.
Yeah. I wonder too, like, do you see that at all connected to, I'm thinking of like the John Deere strike that's happening right now, and how, if you're not paying attention to this, or before this, it was easy to think of John Deere and just see the tractor, the logo, things like that. But now I think, for me at least, that's going to be inextricably linked to this massive labor action that's happening. I wonder, especially with a city like Detroit, where UAW is so, has such a rich history, how does the sort of the distance from the sort of material realities of labor skew our perspective of the world, because we live in a world of product and consumption?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's magnified right now, right? Even as quarantine starts to crumble a little bit and we get out in the world, we're not really getting out in the real world. We are trying to stay within certain safer feeling spaces, and we're only communicating with people that we trust. And a lot of us have lost like very major relationships that would, in normal circumstances, maybe allow us to question our views about certain things. And so it does feel still, even as things are opening up a little bit, that we're all pretty solidly siloed. And the very exciting sort of labor moment that we're in, and there have been a number of these in recent years that have just been like super invigorating. And so it doesn't feel new to me that there would be this new exciting labor movement. It feels like we've been having a couple of years of like building awareness of what the increase in productivity and demands on human bodies can do to people. But yeah, I mean, I don't know where I'm going to go with that, but it's an exciting time, but it doesn't feel to me like people are so much aware that it's exciting, because they're tending to stay in these very small, safe, disease-free spaces for good reason.
Totally.
But it would be great if we had newspapers again, or some sort of media that actually functioned, that everyone was engaged in participating in, so we could actually sort of have a national conversation about how great these things are.
Yeah, or at least a conversation that is not as polarized as what's possible in a lot of virtual spaces right now, it feels like.
Yeah, everything feels rough right now. Still.
Totally.
Yeah.
Well, I do want to encourage people, as somebody said in the chat, to drop your questions in, to ask a question, or feel free to drop them in the chat. I feel like it's not moving too fast. We'll be able to catch them.
I haven't even looked at this chat. Hello, chatters. Oh, so many people I like so much. Yes, do feel free to ask some questions. I do want to give a shout out to Rent Party Detroit, who's probably about to come on and talk to us a little bit.
We'll hear from them shortly. Yeah.
Okay, good. So the book really is built, and I was talking a little bit about this earlier on the NPR interview that I did with WDET. The book is really built, it sort of uses this joke structure to build up an awareness of this very real material culture that exists in Detroit now, that is largely the product of one of the worst foreclosure crises in the history of the country. And so, 1/4 of the housing stock in Detroit was foreclosed on between 2011 and 2014. Linda, do I have that right? And what that means is that, in terms of the trauma that I talked about trying to convey to the readers, that there's a lot of sort of pre-existing trauma in the city that is definitely about being able to operate in a sustainable housing situation. And as I move through the book, or as the reader moves through the book, and we become aware of the history of my house and how it was involved in this foreclosure crisis, and how that ended up affecting the woman who owned it and the city's illegal seizure of it, the relationship with the title, Gentrifier, changes, obviously, but also hopefully you kind of sink into this awareness that these very deep traumas that exist in some of these spaces, in Detroit in particular, continue to impact us all the time. And so Linda is here, and I would love for her to please talk a little bit about what Rent Party Detroit does to alleviate some of that trauma.
Hi, everyone. I'm Linda Jordan. I'm the founder of Rent Party Detroit, and I'm so thrilled to be here. Thank you so much for having me. This is a great conversation. Rent Party is an emergency fund that raises money to prevent eviction in Detroit, Hamtramck, and Highland Park. We raise money through cultural and social events. So the idea is that anyone can make their event, no matter what it is, like a virtual book release, for example. Anything can be a rent party. So we've had concerts, we've had book releases, we've had sales at local stores. So anything can be a rent party. And of course, people can donate directly to the fund also. We work really hard to make sure that everyone's donations go directly to people who need them. So we received a small grant last year. So any of our costs that are associated with it come from the grant and not from your donations. So donations go directly to people who are facing eviction. This organization was founded last year, and I founded it because I am an attorney by trade, and I was practicing in 36th District Court in Detroit, an eviction court, doing eviction defense work. And routinely, people were evicted. It's really an eviction mill. It's one of the busiest courts in the country, and most people don't have lawyers. A lot of people don't assert their defenses, and there's such a backlog of cases that judges would just push them through. So it was very much an eviction mill. People were being evicted even though their landlords didn't comply with local regulations that required them to get an inspection and make sure their house wasn't full of lead. So I had clients being evicted even though they had like a foot of standing sewage in their basement. It was just, when you think about Detroit, it's some of the things you see there. It's important to keep the shock because I saw so many terrible housing situations where it almost became commonplace, right? But you have to remember that this is, it's shocking, and it doesn't happen everywhere. It doesn't happen in places that have the same laws that are just the suburbs that are mostly white. So this fund was designed to help people who are in that situation where they're facing an imminent threat of eviction. So, and sometimes they just need a little bit of money to get them to the next month. So I saw people evicted over $300. And it's like, why are we doing this? And trauma is the right word. Like, people who face an eviction, it's a traumatic experience. We know it's really a public health crisis. Even before the pandemic, it was, because of how stress lives in your body and makes you susceptible to all sorts of other diseases and early death. So people, even before the pandemic, it was 1 in 4 Detroiters faced an eviction each year. That's a huge part of the population. And it was just commonplace, and it still is. So the idea of this fund was to get people involved and to have an avenue to say, this isn't going to stand in my community. I don't want this. I don't want people to be evicted over $300 and their kids have to change school. And then they're, it's a spiral, and people become homeless because of it. Knowing that eviction is really a driver of poverty and not just a symptom, we wanted to do what we could to stabilize people who are not able to access funds to stay in their homes. At the time when I started this in Michigan, there was no rental assistance, zero, like none. When we talk about government failures, like that is one, that the state of Michigan or the city of Detroit or anybody, no one had a fund to help tenants. Right now, we do have some government funding through the federal government, through the various COVID relief bills. That funding, unfortunately, a lot of it gets tied up in bureaucracy, and people don't qualify for various reasons. So this fund is meant to fill in the gaps, right? If someone doesn't qualify for government funding, we have a pot of money that helps them stay housed. And we're not a big organization, but we did start last year, and we were able to raise $14,000 that all went to tenants facing eviction. So if you want to learn
That's
more,
fantastic.
thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions. I do think this conversation about eviction being a trauma is really important, and sort of the divide between like institutionalized racism and the failure of political structures, and then how people really experience that, right? Because then you talk about individual people going through this process of eviction, and it's really faceless, and it's very much people feel very isolated and don't know that it's really, a lot of them don't know that it's part of this larger systemic issue. And there's just so much history that goes into it in Detroit, especially because Detroit actually used to be a majority homeowner city. And then we had various crises like the mortgage and foreclosure crisis, and it became a majority renter city in about 2017. So actually pretty recently. And then there was just terrible housing stock and really bad conditions for people. So we want people to have homes. We want people to have safe homes that don't have standing sewage or lead in the basement. So that's what we're working for.
Totally.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much, Linda. There's been so much cool housing organizing happening this last year. Thank you for being a part of that. And the link there in the chat is rentpartydetroit.org/donate. And then we do have a couple of questions.
We did, and I thought that Jacinta's might be a good way to.
Yeah, it feels like a good way to transition.
To tie those in. Yeah. In that
can I just read the question first?
Yeah, please.
So, spoiler alert, by the end of the book, you have not yet had contact with the previous owner of the house. Have you since had any contact?
Yeah, and so the book imagines the woman, the previous owner of my house. I know slightly more about her than I had let on in the book, of course, to protect her privacy as someone who had been, a victim of city-induced trauma of an totally illegal foreclosure on her house. The documents that I have even have the city admitting that it was completely illegal. On top of which, it was illegal for the city to turn around and sell that property to the organization that gave it to me. And that has recently been verified as not constitutional. And so she is now also owed a bunch of money from the city. And so I had been considering, and there's a couple moments in the book where I try to find her, or I try to sort of figure out where she is or track her down, partially because all of the court documents indicated to me that the city basically found it impossible, that she was just untrackable and she was impossible to find. And I really, Googled for a couple of minutes and found a phone number and called it. And I'm pretty sure I talked to her son. So that was not true at all. She was very easy to locate. But I decided, in specific response to the question, I decided not to try to track her down too much, because I didn't want the book to be like, I didn't want to all of a sudden find this woman who had probably been, living under various kinds of duress and be like, hey, now you have to respond to this like big narrative that I've been working on this whole time. So I kind of left that part for some future project. But since that has happened, now this Supreme Court case has been decided, and now that she's owed about $5,000, and I do feel some responsibility now to think about trying to track her down and at least alert her to the fact, because I know the city hasn't bothered to inform her, at least alert her to the fact that she's owed this money and try to help her figure out a way to get her hands on it.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll take another question here. This one is from, I'm not sure if it's Holly or Haley, apologies. But other than Virginia Woolf, what other works influenced you while you were working on Gentrifier?
Such a good question. I was in a Notion store in Brooklyn the other day, and I was just like buying presents or whatever, and like just chit-chatting with the woman who owns the store. And had to buy a present for, a friend, and she was like, "What's this? What is this for?" And I was like, "Oh, da 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 da, but I have to do it soon because I'm going and I have this book release party." And she was like, "What's the book?" And I told her the name and a little bit about what the book is, and she was like, "Oh, it sounds like you're really doing an interesting, combination of Barbara Ehrenreich's Nickeled and Dimed and Matthew Desmond's Evicted." And I was kind of like, "Oh my God, you are the best literary critic I have ever met in my life." And so those two works are always influential on me. And those two works in particular were influential in the specific manner in which I wrote about the housing crisis in Detroit. But also structurally, I think way more influential was comics. My work in comics allowed me to figure out how to visualize these individual pieces as largely visual chunks of text, and then place them in a way that I could control emotionally. And I think, Nick Dernasso comes to mind a lot as a really smart creator. But of course, like my big influences in the world of comics are always people like Linda Berry and Julie Doucet and all the people I've been talking about every day for my entire life. But it has been interesting talking about this book as being heavily influenced by comics. I think a lot of people have noticed that, which is great.
Totally.
Yeah.
All right, I think we have time for one more here. And this comes from Kelly. Curious if the book addresses that institutional investors / hedge funds are buying up all these foreclosed properties and renting them back to the community at very high prices, especially considering the condition. And Linda, I don't know if maybe you can help us out on this as well.
Yeah, you might have more to say about this than I did in the book, because there was a lot of stuff that I saw happening. And this is one particularly egregious thing that was going on, was just, rich people maybe that didn't even live in Detroit, just buying up a ton of property. And, anything from like renting it out to letting it go fallow to like refusing to engage in any way. But I didn't actually include that in the book because the book had too many bad guys already, and I didn't want to just open up the floodgates of like, oh, that whole thing, because there's a lot of it, right, Linda?
Tons. Yeah, that's very commonplace. The city and the county are complicit because they made these properties available on the tax foreclosure auction. And they said that if you owed taxes on properties, you couldn't bid on them, but these big corporations would just form another LLC and then bid on properties. So these huge land speculators would buy up the properties. If people were living there, they might try to just start charging them for them. There were also these foreclosure rescue scams, which were commonplace. And those were really bad because people would see that the house was distressed, that they owed property taxes. They would come in and try to be the good guys and say, like, I'll buy your house off the auction for you and sell it back to you. But it was using a land contract, which I think is kind of a Michigan thing. But it was basically a contract that they would write in a really confusing way. And they would say that they were selling the house back to people, but there really was no chance that the person was ever going to comply with the terms of this convoluted contract. So they'd get stuck and they'd end up getting evicted anyway. And they might have paid some sort of down payment to try to stay in this house. And then since it was a land contract, the owner wouldn't make any repairs. So they were stuck in this sort of limbo that was a really predatory agreement. Detroit Property Exchange was one of the big bad guys in this space, and they've been sued in federal court over it. I sued them a few times in individual cases. It was always fun. Yeah, it's really bad, and it was just ripe for that kind of exploitation because of what the city and the county were doing. So really, there were kind of, like you said, a lot of bad guys in Detroit.
Yeah, the land contract thing is really confusing for people. And also, apparently, it's becoming newly confusing in the court system in Detroit because there are apparently so many different varieties of them that we're no longer necessarily calling all of them land contracts, but they are often termed like rent to own contracts. And they're, it was really interesting when I was trying to sell the house in Detroit because everyone wanted to buy on a land contract. And I was like, I don't think you understand how little like power that gives you. They're not tracked. They're not logged by any, government agency.
Yeah.
If I decide I want you out, I can really just kick you out and keep all your money. Like, I think this is bad. And then when I moved and I was in a weird, like, trying to buy a house in the pandemic because I didn't know where else to live, the seller offered me a private mortgage, and it was like the answer to all of my dreams. It's like totally regulated and under, the owner of the original owner of the house, the seller, sort of navigates all of the terms of the contract that are in keeping with what they desire, and then the buyer agrees to them, and you're still working outside of a bank like with a land contract. And it was really delightful to all of a sudden have this thing that wasn't a bank mortgage, and it didn't have the same, problems, but it also wasn't a skeevy, grody land contract. So
yeah, so land contracts aren't always bad, and that's what it should be, is a seller financed mortgage. But because they're not regulated, like you said, people will put all sorts of predatory terms in them, and often they'll jack up the price. And Detroit is so that happens so much in Detroit because people can't get traditional mortgages. So a lot of people don't have the credit, and some banks won't even do it. So it's sort of this reverse redlining situation. So they can work very well, and there are nonprofits that sell people houses on land contracts with 0% interest and with very good terms. But they have been used as a tool to exploit people.
yeah.
All
That's
right.
great.
Well, the book is Gentrifier, a memoir. The author is Anne Elizabeth Moore. You can buy it from the Buy the Book link at the bottom of your screen. Thank you to Women and Children First. Please continue to buy excellent books from them, just like this one. And please support Rent Party Detroit at rentpartydetroit.org/donate. Doing incredible work up there, it sounds like. And sounds like we need some more rent parties everywhere else too.
I would love that.
Thanks to everybody who came out tonight. This was a lot of fun.
It was so much fun. Thank you all.
Thank you.
I don't